Welcome to Goldfish on Games, and today we're going to be looking at this and these. Now, that is obviously an N64 controller, and these are from 8bitDo, with this being a new stick, which is to replace this, well, slightly worn, but not the worst I've seen, joystick. But in here, we have something slightly different. It's a wireless mod kit for an N64 controller that supports Bluetooth. So we're going to be putting both of these inside this and then checking it out and seeing how well it works. Now the first thing we need to do is, well, open this up as well as giving it a good clean, because it's been sat in a box for quite some time. And to open it up, we're going to have to take out these screws as well as the two extra ones in there. Here we have to carefully take off this pad and then this switch. It's our trigger. It's now out of the way. We can now unscrew this. And there we have the thumbstick. These just pop off, and the board should just come out, so there's no more screws. Put our rubbers out the way. And I think between these two parts, we now have everything we require to do a clean. And while the shell has its bath, let's check out the mods. And I think we should start with the joystick. So in this box, we get a tiny screwdriver, the joystick, and there's also a set of instructions. Now, this is what they call a Hall effect joystick. And it's different from a regular analog stick, which is actually different to an N64 stick by the fact that this uses magnets to try and work out how far it's been pushed. Now, because this uses magnets and there's nothing touching, in theory, this shouldn't get drift. Also in theory, it should have a much lower dead zone to most joysticks. Now, this is more or less a standard part, as watch. It has a click, which is what most modern sticks expect. Now, in this instance, it won't do anything at all, but I thought it was interesting to point out. It's also interesting to note that it is designed far more like a GameCube controller than, say, an N64 controller. And how are we getting on with the cleaning? I think you've missed a spot. Nope. No, not quite. You got it. Now let's look at the Wi-Fi kit. And inside we find another little screwdriver, a USB-C charge cable, a rumble pack style device, the wireless board itself, and again a set of instructions. Now in this packet we have the main bit of kit, and yet by the time we're finished there's not going to be much of the original N64 pad inside our new one. It's mostly just going to be a shell with all new kit. Now, if we look closer, we can see the Bluetooth board, and then up here I'm assuming is the main controller chip. It has a connector here which matches up with our Rumble dongle, and if we flip it over we find a 500 milliamp battery. Now I'm not quite sure how long this will last, so that's going to be interesting to check out, but I think at this point we're ready to just put it all together, because I believe, yep, I think we're done with the cleaning. And here we have our newly cleaned N64 controller shell, and I think that's looking pretty nice. So let's start putting this all together. Now, I also have brand new rubber conductive pads. Now, I've had mixed results with getting replacements for other sticks. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they just feel worse than what has come out of it. So it would be interesting to see. But with all those in place, we can now fit the board. Now there's no screws, so it doesn't need to be screwed in, but we do need to position these.
Now the shoulder buttons did not want to stay in place, and there was many attempts and much swearing, which I'll spare you from. So let's skip over to the fitting of the new analog stick, and with just 3 screws it's easily done, and the button is clipped into place, and then it was a case of fitting the ribbon cable. Now it turns out there was an issue here. One of the pins popped out, and I didn't spot it until much later on, which I then went and fixed and forgot to record it.
Now in the bag is this. I believe might actually go in here. So it's a little light pipe. Fits in here, and that should hopefully go over that. I think we're ready to put this together. The light pipe is actually meant to go under this board. I probably should have read the instructions more. And with those 2 screws in, the rest should go in easily enough. So let's get that done. And there we go. We have a mostly finished wireless stick. What's missing? Well, that was... Now this clips in theory. There we go.
Now this operates in 2 modes that you can change with this toggle on the bottom of the Rumble pack, and it's either a switch controller or a direct input one. There's also a USB port on the front that allows you to charge the built-in battery, and when you're doing that, that light pipe will glow red. But for now I think we'll leave it in the S mode and try connecting it up to my launch model switch. And you can connect it like any other Bluetooth controller. You sit on the screen, you press the Bluetooth button on the pack, and put it into discovery mode. And then the switch detects it as an N64 controller. So let's test this out with the Switch Online N64 service. And as we can see, it seems to operate very nicely. And outside my ability to play at a bit of a weird angle, honestly that's the problem here, I have no real issues with this controller. There are a few extra buttons on the Rumble pack that will work here. we have the ZL button that will bring up the menu. We can press the share button to take screenshots, and there's one to take us back to the home screen. So you can use this as a regular controller on the Switch. And so I decided to give it a go on something else, and possibly one of my favourite series, Picross. And using the controller here was lovely, as the replaced rubber contacts made for a very satisfying press on the D-pad. There's just enough resistance that it almost feels like a micro switch, which is exactly how I like my pads to feel. And now we've got to ask, does that rumble pack live up to its name? So let's try it out in the original rumble title, Star Fox 64. And it does work! It's not as strong as the original rumble pack or most other controllers on the market at the moment, but it does trigger when I expect it. So that does seem to work well enough. And through all my testing with it, I didn't really notice any lag with the button presses. I'm sure someone out there will detect problems, but it wasn't me. And I really feel that this is where this kit was really aimed at being used with the Nintendo Switch.
Aim for the open spot. Hey, Einstein,
But let's give it a chance on PC as well, and for that we'll have to switch it to direct input mode, and then we can add it as a Bluetooth device in Windows. And when we look up the joystick settings, we can see it really is a classic D input device. We have a hat, the C buttons are mapped to axes, which can be a bit weird when trying to press both directions at the same time. But I think all of it is enough for us to try it out with Project 64, which has a few options for setting up the controller. And as a basic controller, it works well enough here. I think it might be a little bit too sensitive, but it's still not the worst controller I've ever used. I did also attempt to try and get rumble to work here, but I had absolutely no luck. And looking it up, it seems that you get better results with an X input device than with direct input. And because it is that older standard, it means that we can't use it with many newer games, as support is far more limited to X input these days. Now I have heard of people putting it into Switch mode and then using Steam's built-in controller support, but I've never had anything but pain and hassle when I've tried to use it, so these days I tend to avoid it at all costs. Another option might be to use something like X360 CE, a direct to X input wrapper, but I have managed to find the odd game, as we've been seeing, that works quite nicely with it. But, I hear you cry, what about the N64? How can I use this with an original machine? And that is where this dongle comes in, a blue retro for the N64. Mine was made by RetroScaler, but there are other people also selling them, and you can even make them for yourself. And as the name hints at, this adds Bluetooth controller support to the N64. And the firmware even detects the Switch N64 controller and has it as a mapping option. So here I am using a wireless N64 controller on an actual N64 via Bluetooth. And how cool is that? Well, it is cool when it works, as this isn't perfect, as I've had it randomly switch the A and B buttons around, and sometimes the C buttons won't work at all. And I've never gotten it to rumble, ever. Now I've messed around with the web config and I've tried a few different firmwares, but this seems to be a big issue, as it's even been noted by others on a GitHub discussion, so hopefully they can fix this in the future. Now one last thing I want to touch on, because I know you're all wanting to know this, is how well does the Hall effect sensor work, and how does it stack up with the original controller? As well as, well, does the wireless kit have an effect on the stick as well. And thanks to having a second Hall effect stick, as well as a number of other different controllers, we can use the controller test program to check it out. And first up is my original controller. That puts a decent showing in for a 25-year-old loose stick. The Tribute 64 has a much greater range, much larger than it's meant to, but it does seem to line up with the correct points. Where my wired Hall effect controller looks bang on the money. That's much better than I was expecting. To throw a bit of variety into the mix, I tried my Xbox One controller via the Blue Retro. And while the graph does look a bit odd, that's mostly down to it not having the notches, and I'm having to guess where it's meant to be. So overall, I don't think it's too bad. Which really makes the wireless Hall effect stick stand out a little bit. As while parts of it seem quite fine, it does seem quite flat along the top. Now I tried a number of times and I got a few different results, including ones that looked very close to the wired version. But more often than not, this is what I saw. And for a direct comparison, here are all of them on the screen at once. So what are my final thoughts on it? Well, the basics feel great, both the stick and the weight of the controller, and as a wireless one, I think it is quite neat. I'm still not sure of the battery life, but it didn't seem to drain much during my testing. But I do think it should have had X input support, as well as direct input. That really limits where it can be used. But I think as an alternative to the official Switch N64 controller, it's amazing, as it works perfectly there. And I feel that was where they were really aiming this device at. But if you want to use it with PC emulators and a few games that support that older standard, then it is also a great option. But when trying to use it with the N64, well, as we saw, it has issues. But I think that might be more on the Blue Retro than it. And I think that's a good place to leave it. And hopefully you enjoyed this slightly different video from me. And if you did, then you know where the comment box or those buttons are. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was a fully upgraded Trident, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, as I really did have a lot of fun modding the controller. And I've not made many of these mod videos, and I think for obvious reasons. But there are other videos that I've made on the screen right now that you might want to check out.